Hey everybody, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were all written anonymously and almost certainly not by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. None of the Gospels actually explicitly names their authors. The closest we get is the Gospel of John, saying that the beloved disciple was the one who wrote these things. But the very next statement is, we know that his testimony is true. We also have the author speaking in the first person plural in the first chapter on two different occasions. And so most likely the Gospel of John was written by a group of people whose primary source was a narrative account written by someone they identified as the beloved disciple, who was later identified as the Apostle John. Now, the first person to actually assign traditional authorship to the four Gospels as we know them today was Irenaeus of Lyons, who was writing around 180 CE, so a full century or more after the composition of the Gospels. Many people point to Papias of Hierapolis, writing between 120 and 130 CE, as identifying Matthew and Mark as authors of Gospels. But this is very problematic, and there is not a good case to make that Papias is actually referring to the Gospels of Matthew and Mark as we know them today. To begin, Matthew is identified as having been written originally in Hebrew, which is not true. Additionally, Papias says that Matthew was a sayings gospel, which is also not true. It's not a sayings gospel. It's a historical narrative that has sayings embedded in it. Papias says that Mark was the interpreter of Peter and recorded everything that Peter said and put it together in no particular order, again, as a sayings gospel. Neither of those details is true of the Gospel of Mark either. We also have data that indicates Papias did not know of the Gospels of Matthew and Mark as we know them today. He never quotes from them. He also says he doesn't really like the written accounts of Jesus' life, preferring the living voices, meaning the living people he interviewed who knew people who knew people who knew Jesus. And a good indication of this is that Papias' account of Judas's death has absolutely nothing to do with Matthew's account. Papias did not find the account in Matthew, if he knew it at all, as authoritative. He preferred another story, which has Judas swelling up to larger than the size of a house and exuding a foul odor and basically exploding all over the place and creating a stench that covered the area where he died for over a century. So the argument that Papias knows the Gospels of Matthew and Mark as we know them and attributed authorship to them is not strong. So what happened between 130 CE and about 180 CE when Irenaeus of Lyons already has the four traditional authors named? Most likely, someone in Rome produced a single manuscript of all four Gospels and either assigned that traditional authorship in that manuscript, or someone very shortly afterwards assigned that authorship. And that manuscript then circulated widely, became very popular, and so authorship was established. Now, a lot of people are going to respond, well, why aren't there competing claims of authorship? And I don't think that's a very good argument. To begin, everybody seems perfectly happy with anonymity in the 2nd century CE. Justin Martyr, for instance, writing around the middle of the 2nd century CE, just calls them the memoirs of the apostles. And that seemed to be great for everybody. So all it would really take would be one attempt to assign authorship that gets very widespread and popular for it to become authoritative enough that there wouldn't really be any challengers. And that's particularly true if there was a great logic for the assignment of that authorship, which there is for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. To begin, we already have this tradition of Matthew and Mark having written texts associated with Jesus' sayings. But what were the four most important disciples or followers of Jesus in the New Testament? We have Peter, James, John, and Paul. So why weren't the four of them assigned authorship of the Gospels? Well, James died pretty early on as a martyr, before the Gospels were even written. So James is out. But it's easy to replace James with Matthew because, like Papias mentioned, we have this tradition of Matthew writing something in Hebrew. And the Gospel of Matthew, as we know it today, is the most Jewish of the Gospels. Matthew is actually almost certainly a Judaizer and is quoting heavily from the Hebrew Bible. Matthew's Gospel is also the only one that mentions the calling of Matthew by that name. In the other Gospels, the tax collector is Levi. But in Matthew, the tax collector is named as Matthew. So this is a wonderful candidate for the text, Papias says was written by Matthew, and they're not really concerned for the incongruity between the details Papias provides and the actual text of the Gospel of Matthew. So that leaves Peter, John, and Paul. Now, Peter already had a spurious gospel attributed to him, so they probably wouldn't want to assign another one to him. But we already have Papias' tradition that Mark, the interpreter of Peter, was the one who wrote down the sayings of Jesus. And so the Gospel of Mark has a very easy assignment of this character, this figure named Mark. So then we have Paul and we have John. Paul could not have been the author of the Gospel we know as Luke, because that author wrote Luke and Acts. However, that author identifies themselves as one of the close traveling companions of Paul in the book of Acts, and was a Gentile and was someone who fits the bill for the authorship of Luke and Acts. And so assigning authorship to Luke tags Paul's base, where Mark tags Peter's base, and that just leaves John can very easily be assigned authorship of the Gospel of John and identified as the beloved disciple. So there is an internal logic to the authorship of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. To the four Gospels, it matches the tradition that would have already been in circulation spread by Papias, who probably got it from somewhere else. And thus, by the time of Irenaeus of Lyons, those four authors had become authoritative as the authors of the four Gospels of the New Testament. There was no need for debate. There was no room for it. It had already become authoritative. But the four authors of the Gospels in our New Testament are almost certainly not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They were written anonymously, and we will never know who wrote them.